Paul's Case, Chapter 2. The eastbound train was plowing through a January storm. The dull dawn was beginning to show gray when the engine whistled a mile out of Newark, New Jersey. Paul started up from the seat where he had lain curled in an uneasy slumber and peered out the window. The snow was whirling and curling above the white bottomlands. Lights shone from the scattered houses, and a gang of laborers who stood beside the track waved their lanterns. Paul had slept very little. He had felt grimy and uncomfortable. He had made the all-night journey in a day coach, partly because he was ashamed, dressed as he was, and partly because he was afraid of being seen there by some Pittsburgh businessmen who might have noticed him in Denny and Carson's office. When the whistle awoke him, he clutched at his breast pocket, glancing about him with an uncertain smile. Around him he saw people who were still sleeping. An untidy woman across the aisle from him, with her face looking like an open-mouthed oblivion, and even some crummy, crying babies who were, for once, asleep. Paul settled back asleep, struggling with his impatience as best as he could. When he arrived at the Jersey City station, Paul hurried through his breakfast, and keeping a sharp eye about him. After he reached the 23rd Street station, he consulted a cabman and had himself driven to a menswear establishment that was just opening for the day. He spent upward of 2 hours there, buying without consideration or care. His new street suit he put on in the fitting room, the frock coat, and the dress clothes he had bundled into the cab with his linen. Then he drove to a hatter's and a shoe house. His next errand was at Tiffany's, where he selected his silver and a new scarf pin. He would not wait to have his silver marked, he said. Lastly, he stopped at a trunk shop on Broadway and had his purchases packed into various travel bags. It was a little after 1 o'clock when he drove up to the Waldorf, and after settling with the cabman, went into the office. He registered from Washington, said his mother and father had been abroad, and that he had come down to await the arrival of their steamer. He told his story plausibly, and had no trouble, since he volunteered to pay for them in advance, in engaging his rooms, a sleeping room, sitting room, and a bath. Not once, but 100 times, Paul had planned this entry into New York. He had gone over every detail of it with Charlie Edwards, and in his scrapbook at home there were pages of description about New York hotels cut from the Sunday papers. When he was shown to his sitting room on the 8th floor, he saw at a glance that everything was as should be. There was but one detail in his mental picture that the place did not realize, so he rang for the bellboy and sent him down for flowers. He moved about nervously until the boy returned, putting away his new clothes. When the flowers came, he put them immediately into water, and then tumbled into a hot bath. Presently he came out of his white bathroom, stunning in his new silk underwear, and playing with the tassel of his red robe. The snow was whirling so fiercely outside his window that he could barely see through to the other side of the street. But within the air was something deliciously soft and fragrant. He put the violets and the jonquils on the nesting table beside the couch and threw himself down with a long sigh, covering himself with a Roman red blanket. He was thoroughly tired. He had been in such a hurry, he barely had stood up long enough to feel such a strain. Paul covered so much ground in the last 24 hours that he wanted to revisit and think of how this all came about. Lulled by the sound of the wind, the warm air, and the cool fragrance of the flowers, he sank into deep, drowsy slumber. It had been wonderfully simple. When they had shut him out of the theater and concert hall, when they had taken away his bone, his course of actions were virtually determined. The rest was a mere matter of opportunity. The only thing that at all surprised him was his own courage, for he realized well enough before that he had always been tormented by fear, a sort of apprehensive and dread that throughout his late years, when it starts, it feels as though a net of lies he had told closes around him, which begins pulling at the muscles of his body tighter and tighter, until now he could not remember the time when he had not been dreading something. Even when he was a little boy, it was always there, behind him, or before, or on either side. There had always been the shadowed corner, the dark place into which he had dared not look, but from which something seemed always to be watching him. And Paul had done things that were not pretty to watch, he knew. But now he had a curious sense of relief, as though he had at last thrown down the gauntlet to the thing scaring him from the corner. Yet it's been only a day since he had been sulking in the trenches, but yesterday afternoon Paul had been sent to the bank with Denny and Carson's deposits as usual, but this time he was instructed to leave the book to be balanced. There were above $2,000 in checks and nearly 1,000 in the banknotes, which he had taken from the book and quietly transferred to his pocket. At the bank, he had made out a new deposit slip. His nerves had been steady enough to allow his returning to the office, where he had finished his work and asked for a full day's holiday tomorrow, Saturday, giving a perfectly reasonable alibi. The bank book, he knew, would not be returned before Monday or Tuesday, and his father would be out of town for the next week. From the time he slipped the banknotes into his pocket until he boarded the night train for New York, he didn't dread a moment or felt any hesitation. It was not the first time Paul had steered through treacherous waters. How astonishingly easy it had all been. Here he was, the thing done, and this time there would be no awakening, no figure at the top of the stairs. He watched the snowflakes whirling by his window until he fell asleep. When he awoke, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He got up with a start. Half of one of his precious days gone already, and he spent more than an hour in dressing, watching every stage of his routine carefully in the mirror. Everything was quite perfect. He was exactly the kind of boy he had always wanted to be. When he went downstairs, Paul took a carriage and drove up Fifth Avenue toward the park. The snow had somewhat calmed. Carriages and tradesmen's wagons were hurrying to and fro in the winter twilight. Boys in woolen gloves were shoveling off the doorsteps. The avenue lights laying decorative spores of color against the white streets. Here and there on the corners were stands, with whole flower gardens blooming under glass cases, against the sides of which the snowflakes stuck and melted. Violets, roses, carnations, and lilies looked somehow vastly more lovely and alluring, blossoming unnaturally in the snow. The park itself was a wonderful stage winterpiece. When he returned, the pause of the twilight had ceased, and the tune of the streets had changed, and the snow was falling faster. Lights streamed from the hotels that stood their dozen stories fearlessly up into the storm, defying the raging Atlantic winds. A long black stream of carriages poured down the avenue, and there was a line of cabs in front of the entrance of Paul's hotel. His driver had to wait. Boys in uniform were running in and out of the awning that was stretched across the sidewalk, a red velvet carpet laid from the door to the street. Above, about and within it all was rumble and roar, the coming and going of thousands of human beings, looking hot for pleasure as himself, and on every side of him stood a declaration of the power of wealth. The boy set his teeth and drew his shoulders together in a spasm of realization. The plot of all dramas, the text of all romances, the nerve, stuff of all sensations was whirling about him like the snowflakes. He burnt like a faggot in a tempest.